you're really not giving any prediction at all, right? So, but that's at the extreme. In math, we call those limits. Just looking to see who remembers limits. Looking to see who cringes when I say limits. My younger son's doing some limit stuff, so it's in my brain. Okay. So, the other thing I just want to plop into your head, and we're not going to talk about it a lot, because right now we're primarily going to focus on when we only have the selling price, but let's say we had both, to where we had the selling price, a Y variable, and the house size, an X variable. Look at this and the variance thing. They're actually very similar. This is the covariance. Co meaning how two things work together. Yi minus the mean of Y. Well, that's all that's up there in the variance one, right? Xi minus the mean of X. That's not up there. It's new because now we're talking about two variables. And then we divide by n. If for the sample, we divide by n minus 1. Just for those of you really on top of things, basically the covariance of y with x. Does everybody see that definition? Mm-hmm. We'll talk a little bit about it. Well, the variance is like the covariance of y with itself. So if it is the covariance of y and y, this would be yi minus mu y times yi minus mu y, and that's just the variance. So covariance also talks about the spread of the data, but the spread in a different way, the y's versus the x's. We'll get to that, but just when the time comes, it'll help to just kind of have this in the back of your mind. Here's what I want to highlight though, because this is really important. You see Jonathan, or am I just staying in your way? I'm not staying in your way the whole, well, I guess you can see that one if you need that. Okay. Let's say this, because I think this is fairly reasonable. What do you think bigger houses tend to sell for, more or less? Okay, you can be in a weird neighborhood where all the big houses are falling apart and all the newer houses tend to be smaller and you get some weird ranking. But for most neighborhoods, barring something like that, bigger houses are going to sell for more, right? What we're saying then is when X is bigger on average, a bigger house, right, bigger than the mean, Y is going to tend to be bigger than that mean as well. Meaning that both of these things are positive. And what's a positive times a positive?
Positive.
A positive. Okay, when X is below average, that means this is going to be negative, right? The X we have minus the bigger mean is going to be, the mean's going to be bigger, so it's negative. And as you just told me, the house is going to tend to sell for less than the average because it's small. So this is going to be negative. Well, what's a negative times a negative?
Positive.
Positive. So no matter which it is, which side of the mean it's on, these two things tend to either both going to be above or both be below together. Notice I said tend to be. It doesn't have to be that for everything, but if it tends to be like that for most of the observations, then this thing, the covariance, is going to be positive. What if it is the exact opposite? The big houses sold for less. Well, then when X is bigger than the mean, Y would be less than the mean. And what would the sign of this be?
Minus.
Negative. So when variables tend to move together, up or down, their covariance tends to be positive. Or is positive when that happens. When they move in opposite directions, the covariance is negative. In business, as well as like biology and anything else, knowing whether things move together or opposite can be a really damn useful thing. Okay? Ultimately, we're going to talk about taking all of this conceptual crap and actually doing stuff in economics with it and decision making with it. So we got to build up to where everybody understands the tools, but this is going to be useful stuff. Yeah, question?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Probably not, because I just shoot from the hip. None of this is actually true. I'm just which part? Which part?
When the variables tend to move together.
Okay, so when the variables tend to move together, we say they have positive covariance. When they tend to move in opposite directions, it's negative covariance. Yes, ma'am.
What if the variables are more than 2? Because we're dealing with square here, and you're square rooting it, and you're taking 2 variables. How about there is more than 1? What about small, big, and medium? How do you take care of that?
Small, big, and medium. Which, well, I just want to make sure I know the answer to the question. I just want to make sure I answer your question.
Suppose you're taking the houses, right, ranges. You're talking about the smaller range of houses and the highest priced houses. How about you?
Well, no. So I'm not necessarily saying it's only got to be small.
For an example,
it could be anything on a continuum.
Right.
It's just that as the numbers keeps getting bigger, the size as the size gets bigger, the selling price gets bigger. But it could be a continuous variable.
I mean, in a different example, if you have to consider 3 variables, then what is?
So I don't think you. So can I try to? I think I know what you're asking, but I'm not quite sure you're asking it quite right. I don't think you mean different values for the y's or x's. I think you mean like a y and x and then a z.
Right. Yes.
Okay. All right. Wow. You want to get complicated? Okay. There is still the notion of covariance. It is still a measure of 2 variables at a time. But what it gets is then you have y versus x, y versus z, and x versus z. And it creates what you call a variance-covariance matrix, which is actually a very important thing. By the way, if you think of the matrix, because I can tell you get this, the diagonal is variance because it's x versus x, y versus y, z versus z. And the off diagonals are the individual covariances.
I've seen that.
Make sense? And in fact, that's like graduate statistics class 2. So you're way ahead. But the answer is, you can do it. We're not going to talk about it, but I mean, great question. But yeah, so it's all that's part of what we do. Once you start doing that, though, statistics turns into a lot of linear algebra. If you have linear algebra, me too. I don't know. I thought it was one of the more boring classes. That's like determinants and stuff like that, vectors. But it's all doable. In fact, I know most professors say don't go to Wikipedia. You never know who made up what. Go there for math and statistics because mathematicians, statisticians are such nerds. They couldn't stand to put something incorrect on there. So go to Wikipedia, look up variance covariance matrix, and you'll find out a lot about it. So, great question. Okay, I like people always thinking about kind of what would happen if the problem got more complicated, and hopefully I'll always have an answer. But if it's too complicated, I might say, I learned that 30 years ago. I'll have to go look it up. All right. By the way, and this is just something to set in the back of your brains. We'll tackle it eventually. Do you remember, if you've had, probably no matter whether you've had statistics a lot, and you've probably heard about the idea of correlation. Right? Are 2 things correlated? In fact, correlation is just covariance, but covariance divided by something that makes correlation the number be between -1 and +1. So it's what mathematicians call a normalized quantity. So covariance, if you're dealing with big numbers, can be like -7 trillion, right? Something like that. But if you turn it into a correlation, then that'll squunch everything down to be on that -1 to +1 range. And we'll get into that a little bit here. We're not trying to kill you with these definitions, but once again, people in the real world will talk about correlation. And hopefully you're going to have a pretty dang good idea what they're talking about. And that's what I'm after. Okay? Because I'm going to be honest with you. You don't have to know this perfectly. I hope you do. But if you know it well enough, and you know it better than the next person, you sound like a freaking genius.
And that's what we're here to accomplish.
And your value just went up, right? Okay? I'm being serious. I mean, I know this stuff really well, but I've made like one comment in a meeting, and I was like, ooh, he knows his stuff. It's like, I actually happen, I do know my stuff. But based on that one comment, there was no way for them to conclude that, but they did. So trust me, and I'm gonna give you little things to say if you're ever in certain situations that's gonna make you sound, that are gonna make you sound.
Get that pay raise.
Hey, listen, if you're not in this class for the money, well, I was going to say, we have a great poetry masters in poetry. Feel free.
Masters in
Poetry's
poetry.
beautiful.
Show me the
Poetry
money.
don't pay the bills.
Show me the money.
Money, what the Beatles say, money can't buy you love. Well, that's highly debatable. Money can buy you just about everything else anyway.
Buy me a boat.
And you could probably love that boat. Okay, so let's see. So all I really want to point out is the sample covariance, very similar definition. We're plugging in these estimates though, and we're divided by n minus 1. You might say, well, we're plugging in 2 estimates there, and what it really is kind of whether if you're squaring them or not, and some technical details. We're not going to kill you with that. That is not part of this class. Simply knowing why it's n minus 1, if you can, in fact, if you are free to use the multiplicity example if you ever get in that kind of conversation, and you will sound like a freaking genius. Because doesn't make it sound like, oh wow, he really gets how it, yeah. And he can what a great teacher, he can tie it to a stupid movie. It's all yours. All my stupid examples are yours. Okay, so I want to restrict this data to looking at book cost, what I meant as selling price. The selling price only. Because we got to learn to walk before we run. So here's the plan. We're going to use this, and we're going to use this to get an estimate for what that next house is going to sell for. And you probably already have some ideas in your head how we should do that. But I want to show you what the right way is. And you might already know that just intuitively. But I can show you why it's the right way. Then we're going to use it and standard deviation to talk about how we set these intervals depending on how confident we want to be in our give or take. Saying what is the best estimate? There's really 2 questions here. What is the best estimate? So we're going to do that with only knowing the selling prices. You're not done then though, because you have to ask how good that estimate is. And how good that estimate is depends on how spread out the data is. How spread out the data is, the more spread out, the wider it'll make you set that interval, that give or take. Remember how you laughed when I said 100 grand, give or take 90? Well, the data tells you whether it needs to be 90 or not. So if your data is just all over the place, we can find the best estimate. But that doesn't mean it's worth a damn. So there's always that second follow-up step that has to do with standard deviation. So Rocky, there's another little piece of the answer. Standard deviation is going to help us tell whether the best estimate is any good.
How's it any different than normal distribution?
It's the same.
Well, we're actually going to use it. We're going to use it with the normal distribution.
Okay.
It's good. In fact, I don't want to say normal, but a distribution, maybe normal, is going to work with the standard deviation, and that's going to set our interval. And we'll get there.
Variance is just very intuitive.
Well, so don't let standard deviation be tricky, because all standard deviation is rescaling the variance, but preserves bigger means more spread out, lower means less spread out.
So does it shore it
But
out?
I'll be able to show you why we use that transformation when we get there, too.
So does standard deviation just shore up the variance?
Doesn't short up.
Nope.
Well, by taking the square root, it makes it the number smaller, but that's not really the purpose. But we'll get there.
It confirms the range. It confirms the range.
Well, it's not confirms. It's going to help us
It's
set
gonna
the range.
set the
Yeah.
range.
Yeah.
Okay.
Know what the range is.
And I think that's what you're saying. When it
Yeah.
comes to this, I try to be real picky on the words.
I got it.
So to where people don't misinterpret. So, all right. So here's an example I give all the time. So my kids play baseball. Um,
Do you run stats?
anybody else kids? Huh?
You run stats on that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Exit velocity, spin rate, speed. Yeah.
We got like a thing that
You do,
attaches
you
to
do.
the bat and the baseball that tells you how hard to throw.
He will light up if you talk about baseball.
Rocky.
Yeah, Rocky.
So anybody else got kids that play baseball? Okay, so Rocky, here's what I want you to do. Who else raised their hand? Wow, lots of them. Here's what I want you to do. In your mind. Go to wherever your kids play, in your mind, and pick out the best team possible out of, what age group are we talking about?
Right now, 5'6".
5'6", okay? So he's gonna go to his kids' league and pick out the best team possible.
His team.
His team.
Well, no, he might actually pick it.
No,
Get rid of
I'd
it.
trade some players.
He might dump the spazzes and pick up a couple. Baseball's a harsh world, people.
I know.
Pick up some of the best on the other team. Okay, I'm gonna do the same. I'm gonna go to my kids' league, and I'm gonna pick up the best players. My kid's gonna be pissed when I don't pick it.
I put mine right.
And then we're gonna play. So we both picked the best. Well, we really need to ask the question, how good is the best?
Yeah.
Because my kid's team is gonna slaughter your kid's team. Because my kid's 15. But do you get the point? You can find the best, but that doesn't mean it's worth a damn.
It's relative.
Amen to that.
Okay?
They're the best in their condition. If you move the condition.
Well, but we don't, as the data collectors, we don't set the condition in. The data is what the data is. And that's kind of my point is, we do have some control over what we're going to investigate, what data we collect, etc. But if we're being honest about it, we don't pick and choose. So I gave Rocky his assignment, right? I'm your boss. I said, go get the best team out of your kids' league. He doesn't have the freedom to say, well, I didn't like that, so I'm going to go over here and do this instead. So in a lot of ways, our problem is handed to us, and we do the best we can. But it's real important never to forget that second step of going back and saying, is the best any good for my purposes, whatever they are? And in your purpose, it was to play a 15U team, and so your answer is probably, probably not good enough. Just like if my kids' team had to go play a college team, right? I mean, it depends how you're using your data, how you're using your best. Because these days, with the proliferation of data, people are using data like crazy. And they're using it very, very badly. Because they've got it, they've done all this work, they get, it's not so good. And what do?
Manipulate it.
Well, they either manipulate it or they just use it anyway. They use estimates. They were the best, but they didn't really tell me much. Well, let's use it anyway. That's more dangerous than not using data at all. And we'll get into some real good examples of that as we move along. Does everybody get the idea, though?
Yes.
This is really a two-step process. Step one is get the estimate. That's the one your house will sell for $100,000. Then when we ask how good the estimate is, that's all about what kind of tolerances we need to give, what kind of give and take to achieve a certain level of confidence that we're going to be between there. Okay, a few math symbols, but I don't really talk math at all, did I? I mean, a little bit, but statistics isn't as much math as common sense. And then letting the nerds go in their cubicles
And go at it.
Okay. Sorry to all you nerds out there. The cool kids really like you, I promise. All right, everybody got the idea? All right, why don't we take a break, come back at 9:10. By the way, she was very good about hiding it. She is so mad at me for not shaving him for wearing sweats.